We've all been on a long car trip, right? We've all seen those rest area signs countless times, wondering if we can hold out for another 20 minutes or so before needing to take a break or stretch. Sometimes you're lucky enough to find those big rest stops with large buildings and food options, but most of the time, depending on where you are, you'll end up with a small one that only has a tiny building for restrooms and nothing else. Well, I was on a lengthy 15-hour drive, and a big chunk of that was overnight. I won't specify where I was coming from or heading to because it's not really important, but I'll say I was in a remote area along the East Coast. It was late at night and I was pushing through the drive. There weren't many cars on the road at this hour. It was pretty rare to see another vehicle at this time. I had reached that uncomfortable point where I really needed to use the bathroom, and I was getting antsy from sitting for so long. I started looking for the next rest area, and when I saw that familiar blue sign, it felt like a relief. A few miles later, I pulled off into the rest area. It was a small one, but there was a restroom, and that was all I needed. There were no trucks around, probably because trucks can only park at designated truck stops, but there was one car in the lot. I wondered if maybe the person was just sleeping in their car. As I got out of my car, I stretched and glanced over at the other vehicle. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't tell if anyone was inside, but it wasn't a big deal. I was just curious. I headed inside the bathroom and was immediately confronted with something odd. A man standing in the corner, facing the wall with his head down. At first, I thought he was just using the urinal, but quickly realized he wasn't even facing it. He was just standing in the corner. I hesitated, unsure whether to say anything. I almost asked if he was okay, but the situation felt strange, so I just kept my distance. I had to walk past him to reach the stall, and honestly, I was a little nervous getting too close. I just focused on doing my business and tried to keep a normal pace. I went into the stall and shut the door. The silence was so unnerving. I'm one of those people who can't go to the bathroom if someone else is in the room, and it was just so quiet in there. I tried to pee, but I couldn't do it, so I flushed the toilet anyway and stepped out of the stall. When I looked up, the man had turned around. He was still standing in the same spot, but now he was facing me, and I could see his face. I'm not one to judge someone's appearance, but this guy was the most unsettling person I'd ever seen. His face was disturbing, especially his eyes. He had a blank, emotionless expression. I hadn't had any human interaction in over 10 hours, so this threw me off. Instead of saying anything, I just quickly turned around and left the bathroom. I jumped in my car, started it up, and backed out quickly. As I checked the rearview mirror, I saw the man walking in the direction of my car. I sped away, eager to get him out of my sight. I felt relieved once I got back on the highway, but that relief was short-lived. I still really needed to use the bathroom. I figured it would only be another 20 minutes or so until the next stop. I was right, it took about 20 minutes before I reached the next rest area. This one was almost identical to the first. Like I said, most of them are pretty similar. There were no cars here, thankfully. I parked right in front of the bathroom, ran inside, and finally took care of business. I felt so much better. As I was finishing up, I heard footsteps entering the bathroom. I thought they'd stop at one of the urinals, but the footsteps came straight to my stall and stopped. I could see shoes through the gap under the door, and someone was standing right outside. My heart raced. My first thought was that it was the same guy from the previous bathroom. He had followed me. My social anxiety made it hard to speak, but after a moment, I finally managed to say, "Someone's in here?" There was no response. At this point, I knew I had to take action. I quickly dialed 911, put the phone on speaker, and let the man hear the operator. The operator asked, "911, what's your emergency?" I said loudly and clearly, "I'm being followed by a dangerous man. I feel threatened." As the operator asked for more details, I answered them out loud, trying to make it clear to the man that I was not alone. Fortunately, this worked. The man turned and walked out of the bathroom. I told the operator what happened, but I still didn't feel safe. I decided to stay in the bathroom until the police arrived. A few minutes later, I heard a knock at the door, and the officer told me it was safe to come out. I explained everything. The man I saw in the first rest area, the creepy encounter in the bathroom, and the second time he appeared at the next stop. The officer also checked my car to make sure nothing had been tampered with. Once everything was confirmed, we both left the rest area. The officer eventually turned off the highway, and I continued my journey. The rest of the drive went without incident, but I'll never forget that terrifying night. I've never been followed before, and I'm almost certain the person outside the stall was the same creepy guy from the first rest area. It feels especially strange because I'm a man, and these types of things usually happen to women. But I guess it can happen to anyone. I enjoy driving at night because nothing annoys me more than being stuck in traffic. I'm from Long Island, New York, and the traffic here can be absolutely unbearable. My brother lives in Florida, and I make it a point to visit him quite often. The drive down is long, though. Depending on when you leave, it can take as much as 18 hours. I like to start my drive early, around 2 a.m., so I can avoid the heavy traffic areas before everyone else hits the road. It was a Thursday morning, 2 a.m., when I left home to begin my journey. I made a stop at Dunkin' Donuts to grab a coffee, knowing I had a long and tiresome drive ahead of me. The reason I was driving and not flying was because I would be in Florida for a whole month, and I didn't want to depend on my brother to take me everywhere. By the time I left Long Island, it was after 3 a.m., and the road was clear once I made it out of New York. The drive from New York to Florida is straightforward. Once you're out of New York, you just take I-95 all the way down. Around 4 a.m., hunger began to kick in, so I decided to pull off I-95 at the first sign of food. I spotted Wendy's, so I figured I'd grab some breakfast there. I had skipped breakfast at home, as when I wake up early, I don't usually feel hungry for a couple of hours. I drove to the Wendy's in a random part of Jersey, and the area was dark with hardly any streetlights. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, with just the light from my headlights cutting through the darkness. Once I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a car there, and some lights were on, so I went to the drive-thru. The menu was lit, and I assumed they were open, but after sitting for a minute, no one greeted me. I even called out, "Excuse me," but got no response. I took out my phone and looked up the Wendy's, only to find out that it didn't open until 6 a.m. That's when I heard 3 sharp knocks on my window that nearly made me jump out of my seat. I turned to my right, and there was a man standing outside, smiling. He motioned for me to roll the window down, but I didn't feel safe doing so. I cracked it open just enough to hear him. He told me that the restaurant wasn't open yet, and I confirmed I had just learned that. Then he told me that he was stranded because his car's battery had died. He pointed to the one other car in the lot, asking if I could help him jump-start it. I told him I didn't have jumper cables, but he insisted he had them in his trunk. I took a moment to glance at his car, parked by the woods in the corner of the lot, and decided to help him out, believing in karma. I didn't want bad karma for leaving someone stranded when I could easily assist. He stepped back so I could pull my car next to his, and I did so, aligning the hoods as closely as possible. I got out, popped my hood, and he went to open his and grab the cables. After connecting the cables to both cars, I started mine up and waited a minute before telling him to try his car. He took his time walking to his car, and when he tried to start it, nothing happened. We gave it another couple of minutes, and he tried again, but still no luck. That struck me as odd because he had been driving it not long ago, so the battery should have had enough charge by now. He then told me to wait as he made a phone call, speaking in Spanish, though the words were too quiet for me to make out. He returned after the call and said his friend suggested we wait a little longer and try one more time. I agreed, hoping it wouldn't waste much more time. Out of nowhere, 2 pickup trucks came speeding into the parking lot, one from each side of the building. I immediately had a bad feeling. I muttered to myself, realizing what was happening. Quickly started removing the jumper cables from my battery, and just as I shut the hood in a hurry, it was too late. The trucks pulled up behind my car, trapping me. I needed to think quickly. I glanced at the man, who was still smiling, but now it looked far more sinister and menacing. I locked my car with the key fob, and without hesitation I bolted toward the woods, running as fast as I could, cutting up my shins and tripping over God knows what. At some point I dropped to the ground, curling up as small as possible. I could hear voices in Spanish getting closer, and I was terrified for my life. I had no idea how many of them there were or if they were armed, but I could make out at least 3 voices. Then, they seemed to move away, and I dared to let out a breath of relief. That sense of relief didn't last long, though, as I then heard my car alarm blaring in the distance. My heart sank as I realized all my belongings, hundreds of dollars worth of clothes, shoes, watches, and bracelets, were in the car. Slowly and cautiously, I started to make my way back to the lot. As I crouched low, I could see my car was still there, but the other vehicles had vanished. I ran up to my car, only to find the worst nightmare come true. My rear window had been shattered, and everything was gone, about 80% of my wardrobe, my suitcase, bags, and everything in the back seat. I stood there, overwhelmed, and tears began to well up from the sheer stress of it all. I called the police and explained the situation. The officers said they'd need to get the CCTV footage from the Wendy's once they opened. After taking my information, they told me I didn't need to stay, and they would follow up with me. About 2 hours from home, I turned around and made the painful drive back. It was the most stressful and discouraging drive I've ever had. To make things worse, I was later contacted by the police department in Jersey, who told me that the vehicle in the Wendy's parking lot had a fake license plate, and the 2 pickup trucks didn't even have plates. They said they would do their best, but I knew they were just giving me false hope. My belongings were never recovered. Those thieves got away with it, and as I said before, I truly believe in karma. I just hope those scoundrels eventually get what's coming to them. I've always prided myself on being a level-headed individual. As a 35-year-old salesman, quick thinking and practicality come naturally to me. I've spent countless hours on the road, bouncing between appointments, grabbing fast food, and crashing in mediocre motels. It's a lonely life, but one I've grown accustomed to. That is, until a night in March 2023 near Las Cruces, New Mexico, made me rethink everything. After a long day of meetings, my last client had run overtime by an hour, and it was already dark by the time I hit the highway. Usually, I'd stop for the night, but there was something oddly calming about the quiet of the road. The hum of the tires against the pavement was soothing, so I decided to keep driving. I figured I'd find a place to crash once I hit the next decent town. As the night wore on, the exhaustion started to take its toll, making it harder to focus on the road. I checked my GPS, hoping for a break, but the nearest motel was still over 2.5 hours away. Then, I saw a rest area sign up ahead, a small blue rectangle offering a chance to stop and catch my breath. It wasn't the cozy motel room I was hoping for, but it would have to suffice. When I pulled into the rest area, the silence was almost palpable. A solitary streetlight flickered weakly, casting its yellow glow over the cracked asphalt. A single car sat off to the side, its hood propped open. The scene felt off, but I didn't let it bother me and pressed on. After all, car trouble is common on long stretches of highway. I parked a few spots away from the car, stretching my legs as I got out. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that makes you listen harder for any sound. I walked over to the vending machine, fishing in my pocket for change, trying to decide between a pack of trail mix or a candy bar when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey man, you got a minute?" I turned around and saw a man walking toward me from the car. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face and slightly hunched shoulders. His plaid shirt looked worn, and his jeans were frayed at the cuffs. Despite his rough appearance, he was smiling a bit too much for my liking. "Car trouble?" I asked. "Yeah, battery's dead, I think," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Could you give me a jump?" I glanced at his car. The hood was open, but I couldn't see any jumper cables. There was something about his tone that set off a small alarm in my head, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. "Got cables?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment, his smile faltering just slightly. "Ah, no, must have left them at home," he said. "But maybe you've got some?" "Sorry, I don't," I replied. "There's a gas station about 20 miles up the road though. They might be able to help." His expression stiffened, but he quickly covered it with another wide smile. "That's a long way," he said. "Could you maybe give me a ride just to the station?" And there it was, the first real red flag. I didn't know this guy, and the last thing I wanted was some stranger in my car. "I'd love to help, but I'm on a tight schedule," I said, stepping back toward my car. "Good luck though." His smile remained, but his eyes turned cold. "Come on, man," he said, his voice carrying a slightly sharper edge. "It's just a quick ride." "I really can't," I said, turning away. That's when I saw movement near his car in the dim light. A figure crouched behind it, just enough for me to catch a glimpse. My stomach dropped. There wasn't just one man, there were two. I forced myself to stay calm and said, "Sorry, I've got to go," as I quickly made my way to my car. He didn't follow, but I could feel his gaze boring into my back as I unlocked the door and climbed in. I looked back at his car. The second man was now standing half hidden in the shadows, dressed in dark clothing. His posture screamed trouble. I locked my doors and started the engine, reversing out of the lot. My headlights swept across them. The older man glared at me, and the younger one stepped into full view, watching me drive away. Neither of them made a move to stop me, but their presence was enough to make my skin crawl. Back on the highway, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see their car tailing me. For a while, the road was empty and I started to relax. But then, headlights appeared in the distance, rapidly gaining on me. My heart raced as the car came into view. They were following me. I tried to stay calm, keeping my speed steady. The highway stretched on, empty and endless, with no exits in sight. The sedan crept closer, its headlights glaring in my mirror. I debated speeding up or pulling over, but neither option felt safe. Then, I spotted a sign for a way station up ahead. It was brightly lit, with several trucks parked in the lot. I veered toward it, hoping that the presence of others would discourage them. As I pulled in, the sedan slowed down, then sped past without stopping. I parked near the way station office, my hands trembling as I watched their taillights disappear into the night. I stayed there for a while, finding comfort in the rumble of trucks and the chatter of drivers. Eventually, I felt calm enough to continue my drive, but the memory of those two men stayed with me. What if I had agreed to give him a ride? What if I hadn't noticed the second guy? Those questions haunted me for the rest of the drive to my hotel. Now, whenever I'm on the road, I'm more cautious than ever. I avoid rest areas at night, stick to well-lit gas stations, and always trust my instincts, because you never know what, or who, might be waiting in the shadows. I unfortunately had to move back in with my family after my recent breakup. My ex and I had been living in Boston in an apartment we leased together. A bit of advice: never sign a lease with someone you just started dating. He turned out to be someone entirely different than I thought he was. My parents live in western Massachusetts, and if you've been to the state, you'd know the further west you go, the more rural it becomes. I'm not much of a country person. I prefer being in or near a big city, especially since I'm still in my 20s. The area where my parents live is incredibly dull, but I'm hoping this is just a temporary arrangement until I can afford an apartment on my own. That said, I'm steering clear of Boston for personal reasons. To get by, I've gone back to working at the urgent care center where I was employed before I moved out. They welcomed me back warmly, even though I've made it clear it's only until I can move again. The downside is I'm stuck working overnight shift. These shifts are easy but boring and completely throw off my sleep and social life. Not that there's much of a social life to be had here. After my shifts, I often grab what counts as my dinner, usually takeout since very few places are open at that hour. This morning, I finished my shift at 4 a.m. and stopped by a bagel place that opens early. They serve a variety of food, so I picked up a chicken sandwich and a salad to eat at home. I also needed to stop for gas and went to the local Shell station, one of the rare gas stations open this early that's on my route. The gas station's parking lot is enormous, yet I rarely see other cars there, even during the day. I went inside to pay cash, hoping to save a bit of money, and then returned to my car to fuel up. That's when I noticed another vehicle had pulled in, a blue sedan. A man got out of the car as I started pumping gas. He set his pump to auto and walked over toward me. Then he asked, "Wanna see a funny trick?" Immediately, I disliked the interaction. Still, for some reason, I replied, "What trick?" He began doing that old gag where you pretend to pull your finger off by bending it down. He kept looking at his hands, then back at me with a smug expression, as if he knew it was stupid but didn't care. I fake laughed, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. He kept repeating the trick, even after I turned away and pretended to ignore him. When the gas pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, I was relieved. I quickly returned the nozzle to the pump and hurried inside to collect my change. When I came back out, the man was nowhere to be seen, but his car was still there, and gas was still pumping. I didn't want to linger and risk catching his attention again. I got in my car, double-checked the back seat out of paranoia to make sure he wasn't hiding, locked the doors, and drove home. The drive was only about 5 minutes. Once I arrived, I used the spare key hidden outside to let myself in, then put it back in its usual hiding spot and locked the door behind me. As always, I tried to be quiet so I wouldn't wake my parents. I sat down in the kitchen to eat my early morning dinner. A few minutes later, I heard the front door unlock, open, and close. I froze mid-bite, listening carefully. With my mouth still full, I called out, "Mom? Dad?" No response. I didn't hear footsteps or movement. My heart started racing. I tiptoed to the foyer, but no one was there. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I bolted upstairs to my parents' room and burst in. Both of them were in bed, startled awake by my sudden entrance. I whispered frantically that someone had just entered the house. My dad sprang out of bed and rushed downstairs, while I followed cautiously behind him. He turned on every light as we moved through the house. Outside, he checked the spot where the spare key was hidden. It was gone. My mom and I were horrified. She still found time to scold me for not being more aware when re-hiding the key. My dad began searching the house room by room, with us trailing behind. When he finished checking my brother's old room, he moved on, leaving the light on. I stayed behind to double-check spots I thought he might have missed, though I didn't really expect to find anything. I looked under the bed and in the closet but found nothing. I went back downstairs, feeling uneasy but curious. My dad was in the basement by then, and I wasn't about to go down there alone. Instead, I stayed on the main floor with my mom. I ventured into the dining room, which is next to the foyer, and crouched to look under the table. That's when I saw him, the man from the gas station, hiding under the table. I froze for a moment before screaming as loud as I could. My mom, startled by my scream, began screaming too. My dad charged up the stairs as fast as he could. The man crawled out from under the table, and my dad, despite being at least 20 years older than him, tackled him. My mom and I joined in, hitting and kicking wherever we could. Finally, the man decided it wasn't worth it and bolted out the front door. We immediately called the police, who arrived quickly. Thankfully, we were all safe, but the man still had the spare key. That night, an officer parked in our driveway to deter him from coming back, and my dad wedged a chair under the front door handle for extra security. The next day, he replaced the lock, and my parents decided they'd never hide a spare key outside again. I can't shake the guilt of bringing that dangerous man to my parents' home. It was careless of me, but I suspect he followed me with his headlights off, as I didn't notice any cars behind me on the way home. I'm grateful my family is safe, but this incident has only made me more determined to leave this place for good. If these chilling stories kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button and share the fright with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another spine-tingling tale. Have a creepy road trip experience of your own? Share it in the comments or email me. Your story could be featured next. Stay safe out there and always trust your instincts when you're on the road. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.